I've started the recording. So while Ara will share his slides, I want to tell a small story how we met Ara, who is Ara, and I would like Ara to give more details about himself after that, and we will start. So basically, guys, welcome everyone. So this is, I guess, our 7th meetup on GCon21, and we have met Ara, I guess, like 4 or 5 years ago. Ara was here in Yerevan teaching 2 more kids and giving an open presentation. So it was a good luck to meet Ara during his presentation. So we got acquainted, we had some beer, and after a couple of years we got an email from Ara, and Ara was asking if we would be happy to organize Global Game Jam in Armenia. And at that time, Armenia was not participating to Global Game Jam. So we have accepted that with the great pleasure. So Ara has provided us 2 contacts to Global Game Jam committee organizers, and that was 2017. So basically it was 5 years ago, and that means that we have met Ara at least 6 years ago. So our acquaintance and friendship resulted to the not only 2 more kids to benefit from Ara's knowledge, but also to benefit Armenia's game development ecosystem, because Ara was the reason, the guy who made it possible to bring it to Armenia. So I'm really happy that Ara is giving a talk today for GCon21, and I'm especially happy because Ara has decided to give a talk on the presentation related to the presentation that I was giving during GCon21 related to periodic dilemma generator concept. So Ara is a really experienced game designer with many years of knowledge, and I would like Ara to give more details about his work experience so that everyone would know his how much is his experience and what is his expertise. Arajan?
Wow, well, thank you. That was a fantastic introduction.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said it or remembered it all better myself. So, yeah, I've been professionally working as a game designer since about 2004. I've worked on console games and mobile games and pretty much almost every platform or type of platform. And my area of interest is, in particular, is mechanics and player psychology, and basically, you know, what's going on in your head when you play a game and how you think about games when you're playing them. And, you know, you could call it human factors also. So yeah, so a couple introductory things also. I want to apologize because I was planning 3 topics, the 3 topics you can see in the title, and I was only able to develop 2 of them to the point where I would be happy to talk about them. So we are not going to get to the dark side of unpredictability today because I wasn't able to develop it enough to the point that I felt like I had something meaningful to say about it yet. So maybe another time. This is basically the first trial of these topics that I'm going to be talking about. And also, just to clarify, these topics that I'm going to talk about, they were inspired by me reading Narek John's work, but it's not even a direct reply. These are just things that I just found interesting to think about after reading Narek's work. So, and I'm also happy we can talk about some of these more after I get through the slides. We can have a real discussion if you guys want to. Okay, so, one thing that I found in my experience as a game designer is that language becomes really challenging when discussing various concepts of game design. And I think that's due to the nature of these concepts. I think that when you're talking about how to do something in a video game, how to implement something, that these concepts are sufficiently complicated and sufficiently subtle that it's hard to fully convey them properly. It's often not easy or simple. And, maybe some of you have experienced this, but I find you could very easily think you're talking about the same thing with one person when you're talking about a game mechanic or a description about an implementation. What you usually end up sometimes finding that you're talking about two different things if you have the energy to engage in a deep discussion about, what it is that you guys are actually thinking about in each of your heads. And so sometimes it even might take a long discussion to get to the point where you can both understand the precise ways in which you're looking at the same exact problem in a different way. And so I think one reason for that is because, just in general in human language, we use symbols to summarize complex concepts. For example, when I say just the term match 3 game, that term is a symbol and it represents actually a pretty sophisticated set of rules and concepts. I can convey a lot just by saying match 3 game, right? And there's nothing wrong with that by itself. That's the whole point of having a symbol in the first place. When I say match 3 game, there's a whole bunch of things you can think about that I can convey. But the problem is that in this domain, at least in my experience in game design, these symbols become less and less useful the more mechanically specific you get. So anyway, my intention with this discussion today is just to explore some aspects of mechanics of some seemingly unrelated concepts that Narek John has described or written about or referred to in various capacities that I just think are interesting, and I'm hoping that I can be precise enough to convey these properly. So let's go ahead and try. Okay, so let's talk about interesting performances. Before we can talk about what I mean by that, we need to talk about interesting decisions. And this is a topic that is famously attributed to Sid Meier about his quote about the ideal of a game being a series of interesting decisions. I've heard this criticized as an overly narrow perspective that pigeonholes all the players into, strategy game players or civilization type players, and that it doesn't consider how different games and game players can be. But I'd like to spend some time to show you how this idea can be thought of more broadly. So let's talk about what it takes for a decision to be interesting or not. I think for a decision to be interesting, it would have to certainly also not be a simple or easy decision. For example, would you like $100? Everyone would agree that's an easy decision if you're faced with that question and it's not interesting. Well, can we say something stronger? I'd like to propose that all simple or easy decisions are not interesting because of the specific reason that they are simple or easy. And if you accept this premise, then it would be reasonable to expect that there are at least some decisions that are complex or hard that are also interesting. But we also have to admit that there are some complex or hard decisions that might not be interesting. And it even might be that when the level of complexity or difficulty gets too high, all of these decisions of these type might become no longer interesting. And there's some intuitive sense for that. When there's a problem that's too difficult for you to really process, you tend to stop engaging with it, and it's harder to become interested in it because it's either beyond your understanding or ability to grasp at some level. So this happens to correspond with Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, which some of you may already know about. It's very popular to write about in video games. This graph here is a representation of this state of flow. Just as a quick reminder, if you aren't familiar with this, the flow state is, I would describe it as, it's one of maximal engagement and performance in the performer, in our case the player. It doesn't have to do with video games necessarily. When I'm just going to use his first name, Mihaly originally wrote about this many years ago. He was talking about the concept of flow in the context of high performance human activities that had nothing directly to do with games, like rock climbing or surgery, kinds of activities, or guitar playing, for example, kinds of activities where you could reach a very high level of performance that demands attention. And anyway, the general consensus is, when you're in this state, this is one where many other positive benefits follow. And so it's generally regarded as a good thing to produce an environment that would cultivate this state as much as possible, let's say. But I'd also like to propose that when you are in a state of flow, you're making, by definition, interesting decisions all the time. Now, one other structural way a decision is interesting, and this overlaps with some of our other concepts we get to, is when you're not sure which is the better choice among two or more alternatives. This is like the dilemmatic choice Narek described and wrote about. So I'd also like to propose that your lack of certainty about the best choice when you're in a decision-making situation, plus your specific willingness to spend effort on answering the question, in other words, discriminating or resolving better than what you can at the current moment the difference between the two choices, that those are the two fundamental components of what an interesting decision is actually made out of. So if we can maybe interrogate this a little bit more, seems like if you had certainty about the best choice, that by itself would make the decision uninteresting. So uncertainty is a necessary component. If you weren't willing to spend the effort to discriminate better between the effective difference of the two choices at hand, well, that would also make the decision uninteresting. Because if you don't know what to choose, if you have two choices and you don't know which one's better, and if you're not going to work to figure out or see, well, what could be better about one or the other ultimately, if you're not going to put effort into it, if you're not willing to apply that effort, well then the only thing you're left to do is to effectively make a random choice. Because you're not making the choice based on any information or analysis. You've cut off your analysis because of, let's say, extreme difficulty. And you resign yourself to basically just choosing randomly. And that's interesting too, because we find that maps to the extreme envelope of the flow state. So what I'm describing is basically, on the graph, if you look at the red dot in the upper left corner of the box, that's what I'm describing. The difficulty of the activity has exceeded your ability to basically perform with it or contend with it in a let's say a meaningful way. Now, the first part of our formula here, the lack of certainty about the best choice, that's not an activity or anything. That's just a state of being that describes a piece of knowledge or ability that you're missing. But if we look more closely at what the second part of our formula means, that is the part where you spend effort on answering a question or resolving the real difference between two alternatives, what that really is, if you think about it, is, in essence, that's what learning is. And if we look at our graph again, you can notice that the only way you travel on the x-axis from left to right is by increasing your skills. But what that additionally means is that the only way you travel from left to right on this graph is through the process of learning. And I have a very important thesis about why learning is so important, but that's going to have to wait for another time because I haven't gotten, that's pretty much where I ended for what I'm able to present right now, at least publicly. But I hope to later make a connection that I think is really significant about what the implication for why learning is so important in the context of just activities in general, not just video games. But it's a little half-baked, so that's where I have to end at least this first topic for our talk today. Oh, actually, I have another section here for the first one. So let's switch gears a little bit. So most people, when they think about the idea of an interesting decision, they usually assume or think about it just in terms of a static choice made in a moment frozen in time. You're faced with a question, and before you do anything else, you have to answer this question. That happens in video games and in other situations too. But now I'd like to show you one way in which an uninteresting decision can be made into an interesting decision only by changing a single variable, and that's time, because we can think about interesting decisions in a continuum of time. We don't have to think of it as a choice that you make or a decision frozen in time. So let's look at a game like Guitar Hero as an example. And I want to use this as an example specifically because I've heard that Guitar Hero is actually used as an example of a game that's great that doesn't have any interesting decisions in it. But I disagree. I think Guitar Hero is full of interesting decisions. So let's examine a little deeper what's really happening when it comes to you making decisions in something like Guitar Hero. I don't think it would be controversial to say that in a game like Guitar Hero, all of the decisions you're making are purely about which note to hit and when to hit it. So let's look at this screen here, and let's say we're playing a theoretical song. I don't know which one this is. But let's say we're playing a song that looks like this. But let's say we're playing it extremely slowly, so that it takes, you see the amount of space between all those notes? Let's say that there's actually 5 seconds in between every note, instead of how fast this looks like it would play normally. Well, if you imagine that, you could pretty safely say that would not be fun or interesting for anybody to play. It would be so slow you couldn't even really get a sense of the progression of the notes of the melody. But it would be slow enough that there'd be almost no chance for you to make a mistake, at least in this theoretical example. But if we take this exact same sequence and we speed it up, then things can change very dramatically. And you'll notice that in a progression where we repeatedly play this sequence, but with gradually faster and faster iteration, you'll notice that after we speed it up moderately, it reaches a level that approaches not breaches, but approaches your limit of your ability. And that you will usually say that is not only interesting, but also fun. But if we continue to speed up the exact same sequence, then after another threshold that starts to now exceed the limit of your ability, it's pretty obvious to say that you would probably then start to report the experience as being uninteresting and also unpleasant, probably. And these thresholds will be at different places for different people, of course. But my point here is that I would argue that the application of effort toward meeting a specific level of performance, that's what you're trying to do when you're trying to play or perform something that's just beyond the reach of your ability. That's a valid kind of interesting decision. And if we reduce that idea down further, you could say that any effort toward meeting a level of performance that begins to exceed your certainty that you will in fact get the result you desire, well, that's inherently a form of an interesting decision. Okay, so that was the first topic. Let's go to topic number 2. So I have no fundamental argument about the power and the utility of crafting dilemmatic choices. I use this device very frequently, but I don't think it's necessarily a device that can be used without fail or error or maybe accidental negative consequence to other parts of the experience. So I'd like to discuss one particular caveat that I've personally encountered, and this is just a personal example. So if some of you have a different experience, I would love to know about it. Sometimes, just the mechanical process of going through a dilemmatic choice can end up in a manifestation that's undesirable. So I would call these unsatisfying dilemmas. And sometimes the consequences of the choice might lead you into an experience that's ultimately unsatisfying, and it might not even have anything to do with the structure of the choice itself. And so I want to talk about one time that this happened to me. So there's a game called Armored Core. It's made by one of actually my favorite software developers, From Software. I don't know how many Armored Core games there are. There are many right now. The original one, you can see a screenshot of here. So this was I think PlayStation 1. So pretty old school by now, I guess. So in this game, this is a game where you basically play as a mecha and you go on various missions. And so part of this game is assembling your mecha. And so they've created a very interesting system I'd like to describe the dilemmatic choices about that they've woven into this in the very ingenious and crazy way that From Software likes to do with their mechanics. And I'd like to show you the negatives that have come out of it that, perhaps weren't intentional. So, when you're putting together your mecha, because we're talking about From Software, and From Software is a little crazy sometimes, they specially introduced two particular variables that makes the process of deciding what part to assemble your mecha with very dilemmatic. And these two elements are called EP and WP. You can see them on the screenshot here. So I'm going to try to explain this without making everybody go to sleep. But it's important to understand how this works because it ties into the consequences here. So your mecha, when you're putting it together, it has a maximum EP, or that means energy point value. So every part that you install on your mecha, it subtracts a certain amount of EP. And your total amount of EP is subtracted by the sum of all your mecha parts, which can't exceed this maximum EP. So in other words, it's basically just, it's a limit on what parts you can put on because the value of the parts are represented by high EP costs. So for example, this, you can see the head is selected in this screenshot. The head costs 210 EP. On the right side of the screen, you can see the EP limit is 4728. If I can see without glasses on my little screen. And the current cost, right, has to be something below that value. So if you get to the point that your EP limit is reached, you can't put on anything better than what you currently have. And of course, we're talking about From Software here, so they're not going to stop at just one dilemmatic dimension of this. So every mecha also has a maximum WP, or weight point value, and you can see on the left side with the head here that every part independently also has a separate weight as well. So that head weighs 232 units. And of course, they didn't just stop there. It has to be just a little more complicated. So instead of you having a total weight limit, your legs have a weight limit, which you can see here is legs WP, which is your total weight limit. And then your upper torso has an independent weight limit, which is your core WP, which is of course necessarily smaller than the legs WP because the core WP is included within the legs WP. And so anyway, you have to be under all of these three limits before you can really use a mecha. If you exceed them, then your mecha is not usable. So at this point, surely you're very excited about this rich texture of dilemmatic choices of how to assemble this mecha while keeping it within all of these arbitrary restrictions. They're not too arbitrary. I mean, the nice thing about this is that they map to a conceit that makes plausible sense. But there's only one problem here. It just so happens that this structure of these particular limits is perfect for a multiplayer versus game. And you could probably intuitively see why that's true, because since everybody has to perform within these limits, it ensures that players get to express a wide variety of different mecha abilities while ensuring that versus matches will always have at least some level of mechanical mathematical fairness. Because if you have a part that you're using that's much stronger, let's say it's a head part, that's much stronger than your opponent's, then that head part usually costs a lot of EP or WP or both, and what it means to equip a very strong part also means that you have to sacrifice a weakness in a corresponding way elsewhere on your mech. And just to give you a tiny bit more context, there's, depending on, like head parts can provide special abilities that, only a certain head part can provide. For example, arm parts have different categories of abilities. So we're not just talking about like a defense stat that changes when you're changing out parts. We're also talking about not just quantitative variation, but also qualitative variation in what you can do depending on what part's equipped or not. So at the same time, is this structure actually made the single player version of the game massively unrewarding and unsatisfying. It's interesting because this game you could play as a versus game, but then there's a single player campaign. And both of those are very equally, I would say, equally valid game experiences. Not one of them not necessarily more important than the other. And I find it interesting that they just so happen to optimize this structure to be very elegant and beautiful for the versus context. But let me describe how it, since they, let's say they shoehorned it into the single player context, it kind of ruined the experience, at least for me personally. So let me describe why. One of the worst parts was that, so in the single player campaign, the way the progression worked was that you go on a series of missions and you gradually earn, in various ways, new mecha parts. But here's the problem, which you might be able to anticipate already. Since there's so much cost and sacrifice to replacing one part with another, what it effectively meant in the single player progression is every time I earned a new part, let's say after the first about 20% of the progression, right? Because in the early progression, you don't have much, so anything you get is very significant. But after about, let's say, 20% of the progression, what it meant is that almost every time I obtained a new exciting part, what it meant was when I tried to put it on my mecha, it meant that I had to sacrifice something much more significant than I was accustomed to in order to use the new part. And a lot of times the cost for using the new part was so great that it didn't seem worth it because I had to give up so much of something else I didn't want to give up. So effectively what that meant in the progression is that I constantly had this experience where I get something new, I'm excited to use it, but then I discover that when I equip it, I discover the compromise I have to make in order to have that, and I don't accept the compromise. And what that led me into, at least in my personal experience, was a progression where I was constantly getting new things that weren't worthwhile to use, and so that was very unsatisfying for me. And so that was just a negative experience that I personally had in the game that I want to share. I mean, if anybody has played this and had a different experience, I'd love to know that perspective too. And this brings us to the final topic, which, as I said in the beginning, I'm not prepared yet to talk about, but maybe if I will be invited again, maybe on another occasion, after I can develop this more fully, I can talk about it some more. So that's it. Thank you everybody for listening. And if anybody has a question or would like to discuss this any deeper right now, I'm ready.
Thank you very much, Arajan. And one small question before going into the discussion. Would it be uncomfortable for you to give at least some direction what you meant in part 3, or you want to save it later for a full presentation?
It won't be uncomfortable, but I started on, I'm very happy to share, I had 5 or 6 or 7 different threads that I was trying to develop, and I just didn't find anything interesting about any of them. So I have to go back to square one on that one.
Okay, got you. Cool, thank you very much, guys. Anyone has questions to Ara? If no one, I will go. Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Arajan, for the presentation.
Thank you.
I have mentioned during my talk on GCon that the moment I wrote the article, I waited about 6 months to publish because I wanted to have some time to see how these ideas can those ideas are going to get proved, or they will have some examples that will reject the ideas. So basically, after waiting 6 months and developing a couple of prototypes, I would say 2 or 3 dozens of prototypes. So I have been convinced enough to publish them, but publish the article. But every time there is such a discussion, it is a huge interest for me to get views from other sides, get views from other people, and to feel the how good those ideas can defend them when they are criticized or there is another point of view. I mean, how they can still survive. So in terms of the Guitar Hero, I would like to mention that when I was talking about interesting choices, I was talking about replayable experiences. I mean, if you take Counter-Strike, you can play Counter-Strike every day 5 times and you can play that game 10 years. So basically you are entering the same level with the same weapons, with the same characters, with the same abilities, and you still play the game every time and you are still happy. Or let's take a chess game. So you can play the chess with the same pieces, with the same setup, but every time you play the game, it does not become less interesting, and even it might become more interesting. So yes, Sid Meier has been criticized for his ideas on interesting decisions for Guitar Hero as well. And I have addressed that part, and to me it's like Guitar Hero can be really interesting, but we don't play the same piece for, I mean, every day 5 times for a couple of years, right? So at first we don't know how to play the piece. We are out of the flow zone. Then we are in the flow zone. We are happy. We feel our competence. We like that. After that, we are already good enough to play that piece with the decent speed. And at some point we are bored and we need another piece, a much harder piece to play. Because it's like playing guitar, it's like playing piano, it's like doing any other activity. So in terms of replayability, I'm okay with Guitar Hero's example, but I don't see it is like somehow contradicting the idea of PDG. Like I mean I don't know, how do you see it? Do you see that it contradicts the idea, or you see that it is?
No, it doesn't contradict it at all. Yeah, so I was a little bit afraid that like I didn't want this talk to be interpreted as a direct reply. Like I was not addressing directly.
Okay.
The last article. It's just I don't want to go to something that strong either, just because it's. I was just I was, let's say, inspired to talk about these other perspectives.
Okay.
But you raised something that I would like to add to, if I may.
Sure.
I find it really intriguing that, let's say you're playing something that is static, so in the replayability context. And I'm going to use an example that's not video game related to show, hopefully, the broadness of this.
Uh-huh.
Let's say you're shooting a basketball. Well, we can argue about how interesting that is, but I don't think it's controversial to say that shooting a basketball in general is interesting because, and doing it as a repeated iterative practice, so I mean, like if we can think about the replayability of the video game called I'm by myself trying to shoot a basketball into the basketball hoop. That's a pretty replayable exercise, but there's nothing in it that's dynamic. And I want to raise this point because I think what's happening there is that you're in an active process of learning at a very high rate and also receiving feedback at a very high rate in maybe a similar way to Guitar Hero. I mean, Guitar Hero, the rate of iteration, of course, between attempt and feedback is much faster, and I think that contributes even more to how engaging it could be. But just the process of trying and failing something where you're on the, let's say you're proximal to the edge of your ability, even if that's totally a static thing, the element of learning makes it replayable because that's what's, I mean, maybe I need to think of it more deeply, but I feel like there's something about the process of learning that's very critical in making that an engaging process, and I find it interesting that it could be so even without any other, let's say, mechanical features to make it more replayable than the ones, including the ones you've discussed.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, and I was thinking for a very similar example. For example, running every morning, or I mean, Olympic sports, anything like, again, running, jumping, vault jumping, or something like that. So people do that repetitively, and they can do every day and with a great passion, and they might like it, and they might be in a flow state. But I mean, usually that's a really good point, but there is some difference that productive activities have and games have. For example, I try to discuss them in two different contexts. Is the activity productive or not? Are you doing it for your job? Are you doing it to become a champion, or are you playing it for fun? So if you are going to repeat some activity for the fun, I would say that we need to have a periodic dilemma generator. Because if you are going to have fun, and your goal is to have fun, and you are going to repeat the same thing over and over again, then there should be some informed choices, dilemmatic choices, and the outcome should be unpredictable. The outcome should be unpredictable, not the choices. But if I'm but if my target is to become an Olympic champion and I run every day just to become better at running, then this is a productive activity. I might get paid for that. I might get a gold medal for that. And this is totally different reason for me to repeat it every day. I think we could discuss these two repetitive things in different contexts. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point. I mean, surely you could always, I'm not saying it's bad necessarily in and of itself. Like, I'm using your example of your, dilemmatic choice generator, or I'm sorry if I messed up the acronym, but your structure, it's there's nothing intrinsically bad, and I certainly agree that you can use additional devices to, let's say, increase the concept of replayability. There's no problem there. But, and this is starting to get into, okay, these are very highly undeveloped ideas in my mind, right? So I'm just thinking out loud here. But there's still the person who goes and runs every day who doesn't want to be an Olympic champion and has no hope to do anything as the output of running other than the intrinsic satisfaction of running every day. And somehow they still do it, and it's still sufficiently motivating to do. Now, in the example of running, of course, there's some other dynamic going on that motivates you, namely, when your heart gets stronger and you're more practiced, it becomes easier to run. But there's also another factor here, which is that when I feel like there's an element of human practice in any activity that if it has certain qualities, and some of those might be natural, and some of those you might, let's say, bolster by using your theories and your devices, Narek John, you could, I just lost my train of thought here, but
you were talking about learning, I guess.
Yeah, there's something in this that separates something that's compelling to engage in, where you are learning in it, and something that perhaps mechanically and mathematically may be equally engaging, but at the other end of it, for the human being, they have not actually learned anything. And this isn't developed enough for me to put forward any very strong opinions of it yet, but this is kind of like the proximity of where my thoughts were going about how to develop these concepts further. I kind of feel like there's something very valuable that I can't describe fully yet, very precious about the human experience of learning, and that if there's games that have it and games that don't have it, and at the same time there's games that have very compelling structures to engage, very, very frequent replay, and there's games that don't. And even though all these things might be related, you can see them in almost independent combinations if you look at different examples. So I don't know where I'm going with it yet. I'm just thinking out loud here, but these are the things you're making me think of.
Yeah. And by the way, I can make it more confusing. So, I was thinking about also eating an apple. This is also a repetitive activity. So if you like eating apple, you can repeat it like every year, every month, even like every week. So you can eat an apple and you could be happy for that. But the mechanism of repeating that, like watching a movie, I don't know, eating an apple, running every day, exercising every day, I don't know, learning Chinese, all these activities have really different mechanisms of repetitive usage than, I guess, games. So in some terms, they are really deep inside, the mechanisms are really simple and they are common, because whatever you do, if you get good hormones, if you get, I don't know, dopamine, serotonin, you are happy because of what you have done, you want to repeat and you want to get more of those happy hormones. So basically this is the reason why we repeat some activities. But to me it feels like for specific activity like playing games, doing them for fun, this is really the part that you have the freedom of choices, and those choices are, there are no optimal choices. I mean, nobody can say that, hey, you have done a mistake to take this choice because this choice was better. So the more you have dilemmas, the more you have freedom to choose between those choices, and the more you have opportunities to choose every time and feel the experience in a different way. Plus, you always have a question. Will I get my goal? Will I get to my goal, or will I fail my goal? So this is also pushing you to try next time and see if you can reach your goal. Every time you try to see if you can, because the most important thing might seem in the periodic dilemma generator, the dilemma part. But I guess it is very, very strong part that every time you try a game, you should be unsure if you will win or you will lose the goal that you have placed in front of you. Because if you are sure that you will lose, you will not play the game. If you are sure that you will win, you also don't want to play. So the uncertainty of the outcome is one of the major things that drives us to play. So coming from...
I mean, I agree with that, but I think I have one counter example.
Sure.
Let's see. And I'm starting to hear a little echo here. I'm not sure, but
I'll mute my microphone. Maybe it's because of that.
Okay, this is a narrow case that's a counter example that I don't know what else it could imply, but and I'm illustrating this case. It's a little extreme for the sake of clarity of the counter example, but. And also, I think it makes this less controversial to say, but maybe an easier point to, come to a mutual understanding on, perhaps. If we had a dynamic where it did everything you were saying, Narek, but it was a system that was purely random in terms of, I don't want to say random. I want to say that you don't achieve the unpredictability by, well, let me put it this way. Maybe if there's no learning in the process, like, let's say it is actually, it's a challenge where it's like you're spinning a wheel, something that has no skill in it and no learning in it. And we could mathematically set it up so that it satisfies all of those things that you've described, at least quantitatively. It could create that experience, but I don't think somebody would be motivated to play because the element of them feeling like they've learned something to then surpass their own expectations of their ability, which is where the uncertainty comes in, or the unpredictability. I feel like if they don't have that, then if it feels like you are achieving that end, well, exactly as you described, but if that happens through some sort of, let's say, purely algorithmic outcome or randomized outcome where like you don't feel like you've actually surpassed it, then I don't think you have that element of engagement anymore. I don't know, what do you think?
Totally agree, and I would react to this coming from 2 points. One is coming from the fact that if you don't have a control over the process, so the outcome is unpredictable, but it is also random, you don't have the control, definitely this is not a replayable activity that you will enjoy. And PDG concept covers this problem by requiring the choice to be informative and to have a consequence. So I've defined the meaningful choice the following way. The meaningful choice is the choice that is both informative and it has a consequence, in terms that when you take that choice, you know how much you go closer to your goal or go far from your goal. So if you spin the wheel and you don't have any control, so you know that your choice will bring you closer or bring you further from your goal randomly, not because of your choice, then your choice is an unmeaningful choice. Unmeaningful choice, and this is not satisfying to the criteria of PDG. So I totally agree, and PDG concept also requires that when you take your choices, you need to know what are the costs and benefits of your choice, and those benefits should bring you closer to your goal, and those costs might take you further from your goal. But anyways, you need to be aware of that choice costs and benefits and and consequences.
I agree with that.
Yeah, this is the first thing, and the second thing that I want to react is also, I mean, you raise really interesting point, coming closer to the replayability from the learning side. And I didn't cover this information on the article because I have tried to be as brief as possible, because the article has becomes very long, and I was worried that I'm putting too much into it. But I
understand.
Yeah.
This is the problem with human language and these things. It takes a long time to cover something very small sometimes.
Yeah. But I answered this question last time I was talking about PDG in a GCon conference. So related to learning, let's say you play chess, and let's say you have very bad skills because you're just starting, and at some point you feel it's a dilemma to take choice A or to take choice B. You have, two good choices, but it is dilemmatic. You don't know which one to take. So after you get some skills, after you learn something about that game, the same situation might become not a dilemmatic choice for you, but already might become an optimal choice for you, because now you already understand that taking choice A is significantly better than choice B. And coming from this point, I also could explain, like Ralph Koster in his book writes that the theory of fun is in the learning of the games. And game designers are the teachers who teach players to play the game and learn from the game. This is very similar.
I'm a big fan of that concept.
Yeah. So, and also he gives an example, and he says that at some point, when people start to play tic-tac-toe, they like it, but after some time, when they already learned the game, they don't like it. They don't want to play it.
Yeah.
And coming from the PDG point of view, it is also very explainable, because what I say is that initially you don't know the system very well, and selecting the square where you want to put your symbol in tic-tac-toe is like, it feels like dilemmatic, because dilemma is not a mathematical concept. We are humans, and if we have a feeling or perception that it is dilemmatic, it is already enough for us to consider it as a dilemma generator. So once we play the game and learn the game, the same choices that previously have been dilemmatic for us are now very clear and optimal, or they are either good choices or bad choices. And once we resolve the dilemma, we already have the optimal choice, and this game becomes less demonstrates less replay value for us, and even it can become unreplayable for us. We don't want to play that game anymore because we resolved all dilemmas, because we learned the game and the outcome of the game is already predictable to us. That's why we don't want to play tic-tac-toe anymore.
Yeah, that's all. I think that's all pretty solid.
Yeah.
It kind of makes me think of, I don't know if they have these in Hayastan, but it makes me think of the game that looks like you can win, that you can never win. And I'm just bringing this up because it's interesting.
Sure.
I don't know if you ever played at a carnival or a fair. At least in America, we have these. They have these bowling ball games. There's a bowling ball that's on a rail, and you just push it, and the rail. Tell me, maybe this, if you guys haven't seen this before, maybe it's too hard to describe. But the ball is on a rail, and the goal is for you to push it with just enough force so that it goes up the hill on the rail and down into a little depression. And after that, there's another incline that if you push it too hard, it comes back to you, right? So you have to push it with just the perfect amount of force so that it falls into the depression and it doesn't come back to you. Does that make sense?
Maybe we can see a video, Google it, because I've never. Let me.
Or actually, here's a better way to describe it. I'll do a different example because there's all kinds of carnival games in this category that are like, they're games that they feel like you just barely can figure it out, but they have something to them that makes it like almost impossible to actually win. Like, here's a better example. At the carnivals here, they have a basketball hoop challenge. Okay, so when the person, it's very simple. It's just there's a basketball and you shoot it from a specific position, and if you get it in the hoop, then you win the prize, and if you don't, you lose.
Okay.
But what they don't tell you is that they have modified the shape of the basketball hoop so that it's actually compressed, so that it's shorter on the side that's facing you than it is wide. So the hoop is actually twice as small as it really is, but because they've only shrunk it in one direction, from where you're sitting, it looks like a normal hoop, okay?
Okay.
So it's a kind of situation where it's like psychologically for you, the difficulty and the perception has been tweaked just enough so that you think that you're learning, but you keep trying and you never actually win.
Correct.
You know, maybe 1 in 1,000 you get it, right? But it's
Correct.
the one where it's like, you know, so it's just, I'm not bringing it up to make a point or an argument. I just find that interesting.
Okay.
It's like, it's compelling until you figure out that somebody's tricking you, you know? Like, there's something wrong here because I'm not able, like, everything looks like I'm able to learn from this and to gain ability by practicing, but it takes me 20 trials to realize that I can't.
Yes.
Something like
so
that.
As long as you have a feeling, yes, definitely. As long as you have the feeling or perception that this system is interesting to you, this is the most important thing, because actually the system might be really uninteresting. Like in the example you say, so you have a feeling or perception that you can reach your goal, but actually you can't because the system is built like that. But also the system is built like that you have a feeling or perception that you can reach your goal, which is already enough for human being to find that system worth to try to reach the goal. So this is like a deception.
To a point, though.
Yeah.
Right? It's enough to a point. These are like the free-to-play games that, right? I mean, it's the same economic proposition as the carnival game, actually, because they're able to optimize it mechanically so that it's just interesting enough to get people to pay a few times, you know, but then ultimately after, and everybody has a different amount they're willing to pay until they figure out that they're being bamboozled. Once you figure out that it's not the learning experience that you thought it was, even though you don't think of it explicitly in those terms, you don't want to play anymore. And it's kind of like I find it an interesting economic trick to foster engagement and to basically get more returns on the product, but it has a dark edge to it, because what you're doing is you're saying, I can get this much money out of this person if I can get them to do this, but then they get disgusted because of the experience they had and they're not going to come back to me after.
Yes,
so
yes.
It's mechanically, it's like it's kind of like a scorched earth tactic in a way.
Yeah, yeah. And related to your dilemma example, the game from PlayStation 1, this was a pretty interesting example, and I would like to dive a bit deeper into that example and understand what was the problem. So basically you are saying that you have a dilemmatic choice and you get some item that you can use, but in order to use your new item, you need to drop your old item. And this is a bad dilemmatic choice, because you don't want to lose the old item, but you also want to use the new item, correct?
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate.
Okay. So I want to understand, like, it seems that if you have used your old item and you are not necessarily needing that item for being able to progress your game, especially if you get a new item, you should have been excited to use the new item and see how you can do with that. So, but
yeah,
you
well, I mean, in the experience, like what happened to me was that, you know, of course you try it, but then after you evaluate it, and this was just, I'm just describing what personally happened to me. So I get the new thing. It's like, oh, okay, I have to give this up. I try to put it on my mecha in a way that, let's say, incurs the minimum sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And then I try it. And when I try it, I find, oh, this is not as good as before. So I ultimately evaluate that the new thing isn't in fact useful for me, and it is not better.
So would you consider it not a dilemmatic but a bad choice? Because if you take it...
I mean, well, what do you mean by bad choice?
Because if you take the choice and you don't like it, you like your former choice more than the new choice, then maybe it's a bad choice.
I mean, it might be, but the other choice is bad too, because part of your evaluation of these choices of equipment is how well does it allow me to perform in the next mission?
Exactly.
And I find that if I used my new stuff in the next mission, I will perform more poorly.
And
so I have to be resigned to go back to my old configuration and leave the new stuff alone.
So great. So actually you are in front of the choice to use the new stuff instead of the old stuff. You want to use that new stuff because it's a new content for you, something interesting to try out. But you know that when you will try it, for the next mission you will be weaker, and sounds like you will have a predictable outcome. I mean, you will go to the next mission and you will lose with your new item. Could it be the case?
Well, it, it was not predictable in the sense that I was I mean, anytime you're rewarded with something new in a game, your expectation is that, and usually games are designed this way, that it is of some new utility to you.
Mm-hmm.
So this was when I was in this iteration of playing, it was the continued new disappointment of every time I get something new, like, okay, this is cool, it's got this special radar, now I can see longer range radar than I couldn't before, so I go play the new mission with it on, and it was a repeated iteration of you get a new thing, you expect that it has utility, it does in some qualitative way, like, extra radar, or you're able to now see something you couldn't see before, or some new feature.
Mm-hmm.
But then I can't finish the mission because I'm performing worse than I did before. So it's not just like, it wasn't predictable, because every time I expected that I got a new thing, I expected that it was going to improve my, let's say, not my manual skill, but my mecha abilities. And then every time I found out that it was not an improvement, and then I had to go back. So it was not predictable. And by the time I got to the end is really only when I realized that, or at least iterated through that unpleasantness several times, where I started to think, like, is the rest of the game going to be like this? And it pretty much was. But I think that it was because mainly that, when you optimize any structure for any purpose, there's no guarantee that will work better or worse in a different context. And the multiplayer and single player contexts of video game designs in general are such fundamentally different structures that when you optimize for a multiplayer context, it usually seems to turn out that you are, in fact, unoptimizing for the single player experience and vice versa. At least it seems that way to me.
So, sounds like every time you got a new item, you have been excited to try it out. You understood what that item is doing to you. I mean, what power it gives you. It was a meaningful choice to you. It was also somehow dilemmatic because you had to give up your old item. But once you progressed the game, you understood that, okay, the game's outcome with your new item was predictable. You could not win the game with your new item. So you tried another new item, and again. So initially it was not predictable, but when you played the game, you had an interest into playing the game. But when you found out that the game's outcome has been predefined, but you didn't know about that, you have been frustrated, correct?
Yeah, but I still would not say it was predictable, because it was a matter of skill. Like, for example, if I was 50% better, then maybe it would be more pleasant and I would have been able to win with the new item.
So why then
It would be possible that... Yeah, go ahead.
Why did you then got frustrated?
Well, it's... frustration maybe is the most accurate term. It was a series of disappointments when I had been, as a player, as a consumer, pretty much trained for most of my life to expect rewards at those points, because it's a very classic, and for good reason, single player type of reward structure, right? When you get progressive abilities as you get deeper and deeper into the game.
Okay.
We don't normally take things away from you,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Got you. I think I got the idea. There
I
was
think another aspect. Sorry, no, John. Like another aspect before I forget, maybe that
Sure.
you know, they may have. You can construct, I think, a dilemmatic choice better, and you can construct it worse. And I think that the trade-offs, I don't know how familiar you are with From Software, but they have a reputation for balancing their mechanics in a very cutthroat way. So, um, in my opinion, if for example, if the costs of all of these, equipment items were different and were balanced differently, it could be a much better outcome in terms of how good it feels to make those choices, even though in both cases they would be at least mechanically dilemmatic.
So the cost benefit was not satisfying.
Yeah. I mean that's probably a good way to summarize it.
Okay. Okay.
It's like yeah. So I think it may depend, right? Like not like just the existence of a dilemmatic choice may not be sufficient, because dilemmatic choices may not be crafted equally well.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so maybe there's something in there that, this is once again, I'm just thinking out loud, but maybe there's some more detail there to uncover. I'm not sure.
Okay. I think I understood the situation.
Guys, I have something related to this last part.
Please.
It's obvious that you were frustrated because your challenge was higher than your skills. So you couldn't be in flow tunnel related to this last game.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think maybe it would be more accurate to say that, like, I was more in the flow state with my old equipment, and the new equipment
maybe you know that if you develop your skills, you will be able to win the future levels with future equipment, but for that current moment, your skills are less than your challenge.
Yeah, I mean, certainly quantitatively so. I agree.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so any other questions, guys? Any other opinions? Okay. So then I have to thank Arajan for this presentation. It was really interesting to come from different points to have the discussion with a professional with that caliber. So it was a great pleasure for me and a great honor for me that you have selected this topic. Thank you very much, Arajan. And
me too. Me too. I'm honored as well, and I appreciate the opportunity to, just put all my thoughts out there and bear them for everybody to, to see what it is and criticize and, make what they will make of it.
okay. So yeah, definitely we will be very happy to have another opportunity to have your talks, to have your thoughts, and to have your participation. So on the next occasion, I definitely will notify you, and hopefully you will have enough time to participate and share your experiences.
Inshallah. I look forward to it, Narikjan.
Շնորհակալ եմ, Arajan.
Me too. Thanks again.
Okay, guys.
And thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you. So next Saturday we meet for the next presentation at GCon. Have a nice weekend, have a nice day, and we will meet in a week. Thank you guys. Bye.